I'll use that because I didn't wear the right shirt. Good afternoon. Thank you so much to our in-person and online audiences for joining us for the first of our 7-part series of Scientia lectures devoted to betterment of the world. We're delighted you're with us. I'm Anthony Brandt, Professor of Composition and Theory at the Shepherd School of Music and Director of Scientia. Each year, Scientia brings together outstanding Rice faculty to examine broad themes that transcend disciplines. This year, our theme comes from Rice's mission statement itself, which aspires to, quote, path-breaking research, unsurpassed teaching, and contribution to betterment of the world. In a year of historic change in the university's leadership, headlined, of course, by our new president, Reginald DeRoche, and new provost, Amy Dittmar, Scientia felt it was an ideal time to highlight the many ways that the schools and divisions across our campus are addressing the complex challenges of our interconnected and interdependent world. Each of this year's presentations will be curated and hosted by one of Rice's 7 deans. This afternoon, we're very honored that Dean Igor Marjanović is presenting the inaugural lecture of our 7-part series. Igor Marjanović is the William Ward Watkin Dean of the Rice Architecture School. Previously, he was at Washington University in St. Louis for 15 years, where he served as chair and the Joanne Stolaroff-Kotzen Professor of Architecture. His research integrates the teaching of design, studio, and theory with historical scholarship on architectural education and practice, examining the role of drawings, exhibitions, and publications in the emergence of a truly international architectural culture. His collaborative research projects have resulted in critically acclaimed books and exhibitions, such as Drawing Ambience on the Very Edge, and a monograph on Chicago's iconic corncob towers, Marina City, which was featured on PBS NewsHour. In all of these projects, he examines the ways in which architects use drawings and images to tell stories and build buildings, and perhaps most importantly, to visualize the worlds that were previously unimaginable. Dean Marjanović will introduce our 3 speakers, Shantel Blakely, Andrew Colopy, and Reto Geiser. After the presentation, we'll have 10 minutes for questions. We then invite you to join us for a reception across the hall. Our next lecture is Tuesday, November 15th at 4 p.m. in Duncan Hall's McMurtry Auditorium, so we'll be moving around a little bit this year, hosted by Kathleen Canning, Dean of Humanities. Its topic is Houston, Rice, and Race, a History of the Fourth Ward. Thank you again to our in-person and online audiences, and a big thank you for the Architecture School staff for inviting us all to Anderson Hall. It's really a thrill to be here. And please join me in welcoming Dean Igor Marjanović. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tony, for that kind introduction, and thank you all for your patience as we switch mics and get all connected again. So welcome also on behalf of the School of Architecture, both to you in person. In particular, to those of you who don't have connections to architecture, welcome to MD Anderson Hall. It's really a pleasure to host you here. So I hope you will also come back, that this is for some of you first interaction with the School of Architecture, both online and in person, but I also hope that you will come back and experience what we typically do here as architects, both in the building and out there, as Tony said, in the world. We are a small school, I would say a welcoming school, a place where many interactions happen on a daily basis, and as such, eavesdropping and popping in is much welcome here in the school. So feel free to always pop in and check out what is happening here in the school. I will try to make my introduction really brief because we will have 4 of us speaking today as a way to give you a snapshot into what we do as architects and how architects can contribute to the overall big theme, which is the betterment of the world. The inspiration for this particular title is a phrase that comes from one of the very significant early books in the imprint that we've been publishing here in the school called Architecture at Rice. And the book number 7 is called People's Architects, and it looks at how architecture acts not only as a form of physical space, but also as a social form, and how it impacts how we as people interact with each other and also with the world. And one of the really most intriguing early titles of that Architecture at Rice series that we published is this one called What You Can Do, and it was produced by a very noted visitor, but also of the school, but also architect at that time, Shadrach Woods, who was trying to use the format of the book as a form of a conversation to reflect in particular on the contemporary, at that time in the 1970s, the oil crisis and the environmental crisis, and what can architects do in the face of a political and environmental collapse. We will all agree that probably today we face similar challenges. So in that sense, this idea of looking back as to how architects can impact the world, the environment, and the lives of people is still relevant. But one of the things, or one of the pieces of writing that for me are particularly significant is this paragraph written by Woods that speaks about urbanism really as fundamentally rooted in human interactions, relationships, and connections, and that the cities and urbanism are developed by physical form but also by social form as to how we interact with each other. And this kind of a outlook is something that is very much embedded in how we approach the practice of architecture as well. Shadrach Woods was also an interesting architect. He was born in the US, educated in Dublin, in Ireland, practiced in Paris for most of the time, was a visitor here at Rice, at Yale, and many other schools. And as such, he kind of embodies this idea that when we talk about people in architecture, we talk both about people locally, but also people globally, about both the kind of what I would say the sort of humanistic and also a global outlook at the same time. We are a community of architects who engage these issues on a daily basis from very diverse perspectives, from very diverse scales. The wonderful thing about architecture, and in particular about our school, is that we don't have departments, we don't subdivide into different fields and kind of compete in how we look at the world. We try to actually come together and share our differences in how we approach the world and design, and really develop our approach through a very particular sort of collective process that I would describe. Today, we're going to hear from 4 of our colleagues who will talk a little bit about their own work. Think of it almost as a kind of an anthology film, right? It's not a panel discussion. It's a series of snapshots where a few of our faculty members will present what they do relative to teaching and research, and to really show how, with the breadth of our work, we impact the world and the lives of people in them. First presenting will be Professor Reto Geiser, who is a scholar of 20th century architecture and urbanism. He studied at ETH in Zurich and wrote a very influential monograph of a very noted modern architect and planner, Siegfried Giedion. He's both a designer and scholar, and together with his partner, Noemi Mollet, he's really a maker of not only beautiful, vibrant discourses, but also really, really beautiful books. After Reto talks a little bit about our summer immersion program, Associate Professor Andrew Colopy will talk about our Construct, Design, Build program and the way that it impacts communities here in Houston. He was trained as an architect at Ohio State University and also at Columbia University, and is a scholar of digital fabrication and construction. Together with Robert Booth, he leads a Cobalt office here in Houston. Shantel Blakely will talk after that. She studied architecture and philosophy at Harvard, Princeton, Tufts, and Columbia. And as such, she's very interested in intersections of both architecture, but also larger lines of inquiry and larger bodies of knowledge that come from philosophy and other fields. She's also a scholar of 20th century post-war architecture, both here in the US and also further afield in Italy as well. The deans do a little bit of research as well. So at the end, I will talk a little bit about some of my own previous research and also how it links to the topic, both of the betterment of the world and how it impacts the lives of people as well. And then from there, we'll take some time to take a few questions and enjoy the beautiful reception in the jury room. And without much more ado, please join me in welcoming Associate Professor Reto Geiser to the podium. Thank you.
Okay, does that work? Yeah. Thank you, Igor, for the introduction. Thank you, Tony, for all you do on behalf of Scientia, also the colleagues who are here. It's an honor to present in this format and along dear colleagues in the school, and it's also great to see some of our students here. I first must come clean. When we conceived the theme of this lecture series as part of Scientia, I was instantly thinking of big, impactful, world-changing projects. But once I was unexpectedly faced with the task to present all of a sudden myself in this format, I had to conclude, triggered by realistic self-assessment, that sometimes change and betterment are also the result of small but consistent efforts that share the promise of potentially bigger accumulative impact and lasting effect over time. Let's see. So the first question maybe to ask is, what's the agency of architecture? What is the impact of our discipline? Architects are concerned with fundamental issues such as shelter, housing, the design of whole cities, larger infrastructural systems, as well as shared spaces of congregation and public life. Architecture is centered around the design and the construction of our built environment, and as such, it affects, consciously or subconsciously, everyone. Its impacts are imminent to society and culture. Because architecture is at the center of such public discourses, it's directly connected to the communities around us. But although the built environment is experienced by all, it is developed and designed by only few. And this presses the question, who has access to an architecture education? And maybe we could ask first, in this particular context, who actually, that same question to kind of broader question of like who has actually access to an education like at this university. And those are numbers from the New York Times, and I always find that kind of striking to see. We're not doing particularly, like we're not in the kind of top-ranked kind of schools, or if we even can call that kind of ranked in terms of median family income, but even as it is high, and we sort of see also like who has access to such an education. So even though there have been significant improvements here in the university through Rice Investment and other initiatives over the last years, education in the United States is clearly not treated as a public good that is accessible to all, and nor is the education of an architect. Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other people of color remain especially underrepresented within the fields of architecture, planning, and design. There's a major lack of access to educational opportunities, curricular and extracurricular programs, and there are, at the end of the day, very few role models for people of color, and many high school students are, as a result, not aware or appropriately informed about architecture as a career option. These are studies, these are drafts from a study that the AIA, the American Institute of Architects, conducted some years ago, actually, and it's kind of striking to see what the kind of perceived factors are that would kind of lead to change. This, of course, also then sort of brings up the question, who practices architecture? Well, conurbations like our own city of Houston are incredibly diverse. The field of architecture lacks such diverse representation academically, but also in the profession. African American and Latinx students make up only 20% of all architecture students in the United States. And it's even more extreme once we go into the profession, where only 5% of all registered architects are either African American or part of the Latinx community. So if we look at surveys, there seems hardly a disagreement that a diversity of voices would enrich the design profession. An increased presence of diverse designers can provide agency and access to the built environment for individuals who have historically experienced the spatial adversities of racism and oppression. And so, given that we seem to be all agreeing on this, the question really is like, what are we actually waiting for? And in order to address such kind of racial disparities as they exist in architecture, we really have to overcome the inequalities that persist in architectural education, as that kind of builds all the way up into the profession. And that, at the end of the day, starts actually as early as the admissions process. I had the opportunity to more closely learn about the challenges of admissions into an architecture program once I took over as Director of Undergraduate Studies here in the school and was in charge of that process that many before me have done very successfully. And acceptance in an architecture program is essentially predicated upon the submission of a portfolio of creative work. That's a really important distinction. It helps us, the portfolio, to kind of assess a student's creative potential, how they translate critical thinking into artistic output, and it allows us to ensure that we select students that will be able to succeed in the program. But for students without access to creative classes in their schools, or to summer programs that are extremely expensive normally, for students who were encouraged to focus on CAD drawing and technical draftsmanship rather than creative aptitude, this requirement can be extremely challenging. So the project that I'm going to present today is a response to some of those challenges. It's a tiny step. It considers ways of making architectural education more accessible, hopefully more just and more equitable, by providing comprehensive academic guidance and support to students from our direct community here in Houston. Architecture Without Boundaries, as the project is called, places emphasis on educational initiatives that introduce architecture within the K-12 setting, as well as pedagogical shifts that can create an environment conducive to a greater diversity of students in the pursuit of an architectural degree. So what are we actually doing? Together with Carolyn Nickel, the director of the RSTEM office, the Rice Office for STEM Engagement, we established two formats: a summer immersion program here in the school and teacher workshops, and then a research component that addresses the question of so-called spatial reasoning. Through its different components, the project connects my interests in architectural pedagogy, my teaching, to research and collaboration, in this case with Carolyn Nickel, and it also forms a great opportunity for us as a school to connect and to serve the community around us. So this initiative started in 2020, and the first summer camp took place in the summer of 2021, partially in person, partially remote. That was a kind of sort of challenging experience, the remote part. It's hard to teach design in a remote kind of setup, as we've all experienced here in the school throughout the pandemic. And we were extremely lucky to basically be able to tap into RSTEM's vast experience and network, and it's clear that we could have not done this without them. So it also, sort of at the beginning, is a kind of collaboration with local schools. We also work with a nonprofit called Discover You that helps us match students in need of such an opportunity to kind of connect to this summer program and apply for it. And so we hosted 15 students in person and 20 remotely in the first summer, and 20 students in 2 sessions each this past year. So as I said, small steps, small numbers still. The first iteration was clearly impacted by transportation challenges, so there's also a steep learning curve even for us. Within these 2 years, it was hard to get students from a city as big as Houston to kind of come to campus. And so in the second run, we were lucky to get funding from a donor to actually bring the students on campus, which also allowed them to gain kind of college campus experience. The program is a week-long intensive hands-on workshop. Pedagogically, it's decisively rooted in how we teach foundational design, also in our school and in other architecture schools. But with the challenge to basically have a number of representable outcomes within the short time of a week so that they can kind of build that into their portfolios once they apply to architecture school. And it is in that sense, in many ways as a program, also a reflection on our own teaching methods and pedagogy, and as that, I think also has the kind of potential to almost serve like a laboratory school where we can also find out some more about how we do things ourselves. The summer immersion is organized in a set of 4 assignments. We basically do one each day, and then the last day we work on documentation. Each one is dedicated to one way of making space. There are clearly many more, but that's just sort of like a way in. And the course takes place here in the school in an actual studio space, so that the participants really get to experience what it means to be immersed in architecture school life. They receive ample feedback, direct feedback. A lot of that also directly from a group of our own students, grad and undergrad, who work as teaching assistants to provide important insight, not only on architecture, but also what it means to study architecture, what it means to apply to college. Sort of important first-hand experience that comes directly from our students. And in return, I think this is also a valuable teaching opportunity for our students to get exposed to what it means to be on the other side in the classroom. We work with basic elements, with building blocks that we aggregate into kind of sort of objects of various qualities set in relation, working with kind of different scalar relationships. We work with plates and sticks. We explore different ways and means to create an envisioned space. And as we kind of move forward within these only 4 days, there's a sort of progression of complexity. And many of the assignments are set up in a way that they're also open-ended, so students who are interested can kind of continue working on them at a later stage. But then throughout the week, we also have some fun. I mean, not that architecture isn't fun, but like just kind of other fun. They get to experience college life, and which is interesting too. Many of them at that point realized that RISE is actually an option for them. Many of them didn't even consider applying to the university. And we introduced students to basic forms of orthographic projection, perspectival drawing, various different types of model skills, and they learn how to use drafting tools. And sometimes the pedagogy is super direct, like here, you cut an apple apart and you start to understand what a plan or a section is. And they quickly learn and progress and draw things within days that are pretty amazing. And every once in a while, again, we break out and do field trips. We visited construction sites conveniently on campus. We had presentations of the teaching team that presented their own projects, and we had evening lectures with colleagues from the school and practitioners from the city who talked about their work and their experiences in architecture. The amount of dedication by the students was really inspiring. Sometimes it was hard to get them even out of the studio for food in the serveries. Maybe that was the reason why. And over the course of the week, they really became more vocal, empowered. I think as this image really beautifully shows, they became really confident in talking about their work. And then we basically wrap up the week here with Paul Hester, focusing on documentation, showing them how they can document their work. That documentation is an equally important part of what they have to do. And we also basically teach them how to make their work look good, and also how to make it look good, not with this kind of photographic equipment, but also just with your cell phone and a piece of white paper. And so on a daily basis, the participants of the workshop had to present their work. That's an integral part, take pride in what they do, get comfortable speaking to others about their projects, to learn to articulate ideas. And it's really amazing to see how far they got within no time. And that then culminates in a final presentation and celebration of the work, including that kind of public presentation, and also in front of a kind of invited group of academics and practitioners that are friendly with the school, and provided really super valuable feedback for the students. So that's essentially how that week kind of roughly works, and I just kind of shift very quickly to two more things. So this coming year, we want to do some work on looking into spatial reasoning. Essentially, spatial reasoning tests are used in engineering to assess prospective students' capacity to read, comprehend, visualize, and manipulate 2- and 3-dimensional shapes. And this capacity is equally relevant in architecture, and for us, the design portfolio is typically what we use to kind of assess those qualifications. There are several standardized tests, that's what they roughly look like, used in engineering schools across the country. And students typically have to take an entrance test. If they don't pass, they have to take additional classes, which tends to separate out and discriminate a particular set of students yet again. And so what we will do next summer is to basically test our participants of the summer immersion as they're coming in to see what kind of progress they made and how they perform at the end. And we're particularly interested to find out how the pedagogy of our program compares to the standardized and far less hands-on and I would say far less fun modules that are currently kind of used in other fields. And of course, we also hope to learn more about the reliability of such assessment for our own disciplinary purposes. And so one of the assignments that you see here in the making is a plaster cast where they basically define a space that's a negative space between two existing volumes, and they have to kind of translate it into a formwork, so inverted, casted, and then uncasted so that they have the object at the end. And these kind of spatial acrobatics are, I think, as far as they get even within that kind of short period of time, and I'm pretty confident that their capability to kind of read some of these or kind of follow through some of these kind of test questions that are given through these standardized tests should be pretty good. The other thing that we're also starting in the spring is a set of teacher workshops because there are only so many students that we can reach with the summer program. And despite generous support, there are limitations to what we can accomplish within this kind of context. And in order to expand the effort, we decided it would be best to find ways to reach students in their own schools, to cut the transportation challenges and to have broader impact and to improve architectural literacy among high school students more broadly. And so this spring we'll be hosting workshops to provide high school teachers with backgrounds and pedagogical tools to address architecture, urbanism, and the environment in comprehensive lessons as part of their arts, engineering, or environmental systems courses. And so it's not based on an extracurricular activity, but it's completely embedded within the kind of public school system. And the challenge is that in many schools here, there are hardly any art classes. Texas is incredibly STEM-driven. And one of the beautiful things about architecture is that we connect to all these different other areas and fields. And so the goal really is to use STEM courses as our Trojan horse to kind of enter that part and bring design thinking into the high schools where we normally wouldn't have easy access. And we'll see where that leads to, but the hope is really to kind of have a kind of broader, bigger impact through that. So, as I said in the beginning, those are small steps. It's a beginning, but I'm hopeful that we can kind of further build this and that the related research, teaching, and outreach initiatives will yield some fruits, hopefully. And before I pass the word to my colleague Andrew Colopy, I would like to extend a few thanks to the architecture students who really tremendous support in the teaching component of this. Some of them are here, I believe. The fantastic admin team, both in the school and also at RSTEM. And of course, also thanks to Reggie when he was a provost and supported the project with a grant, and Kathleen Canning, who is also part of Scientia, who through the HRC also supported the project. And then most importantly, also John Kasperin, who was the interim dean when the project started, and Igor Marjanović, who both have been extremely encouraging and supportive of this project. And then also thanks to one anonymous donor who has helped to make this possible and for it to take off. Thank you.
And thank you to Igor, to Tony, Scientia. Thank you all for being here today. So Rice Architecture Construct, for those who aren't familiar, is a longstanding program in the School of Architecture that asks students to design and then build hands-on, real-world projects. We work with nonprofit organizations to provide lasting resources that benefit our local community. And so Construct is often understood through that lens of service. While that's a key component and one that likewise benefits our students as they engage the world off campus, I want to focus here on the research and teaching that are the basis of that work as a way to underscore the truly synthetic nature of Construct. 5 years ago, Construct completed its first accessory dwelling unit, a single 360 square foot dwelling for 2 separate people. The project was prompted by the need for a local organization to house 2 counselors next door to an at-risk youth program. For those of you who don't know, an accessory dwelling unit, or ADU, is simply a second home built on the same lot as a single-family house. This type of housing was outlawed in many U.S. cities during the 20th century, but ADUs have always been permissible in Houston. Building on the success of Plus House, we began a new phase of research focused on the ADU. At that time, ADUs were just starting to attract attention. Portland had recently made them legal, and California was in the process of trying to enact similar statewide legislation, which passed in 2019. Many cities in the US have now repealed bans and are even incentivizing ADU development. These efforts, of course, are in response to the compounding and interrelated crises of housing and climate. Accessory dwellings, by their very nature, may seem inconsequential, but consider a simple thought exercise. The Houston metro area is comprised of over 1.5 million single-family homes, of which just over 5,000 are thought to have an accessory dwelling. Building an ADU alongside each home could house well over 2 million people and accommodate Houston's expected population growth through 2030, all without a single new road or greenfield site. Of course, to do so may double down on some of Houston's long-standing ecological and social problems. And so our aim has been to demonstrate what kind of ADU we might build and how we might do so more thoughtfully. We've now completed a series of 5 research projects. Each began by asking students to design a prototype that addressed the unique challenges and potentials of the ADU within a particular thematic. The auxiliary project, for instance, that just concluded and that I'll share with you today, looked to create an ADU that was net positive in energy use. While each project incorporates matters of sustainability, they also look for new ways to build affordably. And though there are many contributing factors to the persistent rise in housing costs, we focus on the uncomfortable reality that construction efficiency in terms of labor peaked 60 years ago. Perhaps that shouldn't be all that surprising, as our model for housing production hasn't changed either. With the vast majority of U.S. housing relying on the serial production of low-density, repeated designs built upon undeveloped land, industrially produced in some regard, but ultimately each still constructed by hand. The ADU in this respect poses a more sustainable alternative to infill housing conditions, to infill housing within the existing urban fabric. But it must contend with the reality of existing site conditions, backyards with very real limits on what we can build, and conditions that increase the need for a custom solution, increasing costs in tandem. The auxiliary project, for instance, looked at 19,000 single-family lots comprising 4 central Houston neighborhoods, less than 20% of which, in the students' analysis, actually met the often cited development standard in Houston of 50 by 100 feet. By analyzing specific sites in aggregate, we can better target the reality of real-world conditions, designing an adaptable type of dwelling rather than one idealized to meet an assumed standard. Doing so increases viability, but can also improve performance. Solar energy production, for instance, is highly dependent upon site orientation, which in turn varies significantly across even this small sample set. To address these broad concerns, each project investigates computational strategies at the urban scale to analyze and test prospective ADU designs, and does the same at the building system scale to utilize computer-controlled fabrication and assembly processes that permit efficient methods of non-standard production. To put that in context, the auxiliary project, which began in 2019, looked to examine the ADU's unique potential for sustainable energy production and use. The project's basic concept was straightforward: to build a prototype net positive ADU. Along with minimizing energy use, we would pair solar generation and battery storage. In principle, any extra power generated could then subsidize the primary dwelling. In this project, for instance, a group of students proposed a triangular ADU, efficiently inhabiting the rear corner of the site with entries to the driveway and side yard, and with an angled wall fronting the primary dwelling for privacy. They then built a parametric model, testing, iterating, and refining the type to maximize its viability and automate its design application across all 19,000 sites. In parallel, the group proposed a novel means of wall construction, an accordion-like system of stretched studs that could be deployed at variable lengths, and a faceted self-shading system of cladding culminating in a full-scale mock-up of the system. They produced a thermal analysis of their proposal and incorporated it into a full energy model of their project. Students in 3 other groups completed a similar process, and the results of their energy models were compared. While all outperformed the control, one project was predicted to use 75% less energy and was selected to advance. The project made use of a form similar to that of a well-known historical type, a dog trot, which separates interior spaces with an exterior porch through the depth of the house to maximize passive ventilation. While the internalized porch functions similarly in the student's project, more importantly, it separates day and night functions into separately conditioned volumes, living, kitchen, and dining in one half and bed and bath in the other. The approach allows the conditioning of the 2 volumes to vary, tailored to occupant use. While the inhabitant is asleep, for instance, the kitchen volume can be conditioned for optimal overall energy use rather than human comfort. This logic extended to variations of the type. Sorry, got off one there. This approach allows the conditioning of the 2 volumes to vary, tailored to occupant use. And the logic extended to variations of the type, a work-live separation, for instance, rather than day-night. And again, was optimized across the range of potential sites. And concluded by linking the energy model and urban analysis together to understand the scale of impact such a project might achieve. Alongside the project's unique spatial configuration, the students developed a portal frame system that integrated standard lumber with CNC-cut plywood plates. The approach creates a double stud and rafter system, more materially efficient in structure and more insulative, while aiming to shorten on-site framing and ease assembly of more variable, solar-optimized roof angles. With concept in hand, we engaged Avenue CDC, a local nonprofit that provides affordable housing, with an offer to partner and realize a demonstration project. Avenue's proposed site at the bottom left included 2 bungalows and an existing ADU from the 1930s, all historically protected buildings and affordable rentals. After a semester with students developing construction drawings and a summer spent permitting the project, construction with students began in the fall of 2020, with work beginning on campus at the onset of the pandemic. That fall, a group of a dozen students worked to complete foundations and framing. Here at the top, you can see one completed set of portal frames, including the CNC plywood connections, and at the bottom, the 2 principal volumes underway. Sheathing, installation of weather barriers, windows, and doors continued into the next spring with a new group of students. Roofing and cladding was completed mostly over the following summer. A portion of the MEP work and the solar and battery systems were completed by contractors, but the vast majority was completed by students, along with myself and my co-director, Danny Samuels. Last fall, a final group of students completed the interior finishes, painting, caulking, tiling, and the project wrapped up with an opening this past spring. Here you can see the porch through the completed project with generous fenestration at either side, and a more modest outward-facing fenestration with a large picture window where the living room faces the street. Inside, you can see the main living space and picture window at the left, and the bedroom looking across the porch at right. And pulling back, you can see the project complete the colorful ensemble of existing historic homes. While the net positive energy aspect receives the most attention, it's important to note that it's not the most significant benefit of the strategy, because few things are less sustainable than the common practice of demolishing a single-family home and replacing it in kind. Building a new house to replace an old one, even if it were net positive, can take decades to offset the embodied carbon lost from the original. This is just one important takeaway, and one that highlights a fundamental aspect of ADUs. The vast majority are additions to existing homes. In this way, ADUs are best understood as a form of urban renovation, a means to augment the urban environment toward greater resiliency, and often with a lower environmental and economic cost than wholesale replacement. In all, 63 students worked on the project over the course of 5 semesters and 2 summers. Today, it provides a home rented at 80% AMI, and we've made arrangements to track the energy usage to evaluate its performance for future research. Thank you, and now I'll hand it off to Shantel.
Sorry. This earlier. Okay. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here, and thank you for coming. Thank you, Igor, for the invitation. So I'm going to be presenting a work that's basically in progress, and it's a project of historical research, project of interpretation. I've called Without Irony, and I hope this will become clear just why. So I have a background in architecture and in architectural history. After architecture school and a few years of practice, I decided to go and do a PhD and study sort of recent history to understand how I had gotten these ideas that I had about architecture, about what architecture could do. The modern movement was a huge point of inspiration for me. So architecture that developed mostly between, say, 1910s and World War II. So the role of the architect in those examples was essentially as a kind of mediator between the sorts of material logics and realities and the modes of production that were becoming typical of industrialization, the use of the machine, and so forth. So we got these beautiful projects like the work of Charot, the Maison de Verre in Paris, or the Bauhaus School with its wall of glass, or here in the US, Frank Lloyd Wright, here the Roby House with its dramatic interior organization, which you don't really see here, but it's breaking from the traditional norms of the forms of buildings. So there's an aspect to modern architecture that involved just a sort of method of design, thinking about function, for example, as a starting point rather than starting with typical forms and shapes and symbols, and inventing sort of ways of using these materials that constituted their own aesthetic languages that began to make sense even though they were new, or space planning, as in the case of Margareta Schutte-Lihotzky. But at the same time, modern architecture was associated with a certain ethical attitude in which the architect often concerned himself or herself with the status of the worker, the kinds of dwellings that workers in European cities, for example, were typically offered. Architects like Ernst May, working with Schutte-Lihotzky, who designed the kitchens, designed housing blocks that were designed to give, with an efficiency of space, to house large numbers of people, to afford them a place to sit outside in the sun. So they weren't just sort of workers going to the factory and sleeping, but had a kind of life that they were able to take advantage of some of the goods of these sort of new mechanized world, just like everybody else. Also the avant-garde movements, such as the one that Mies van der Rohe was involved in. He's associated with the magazine which I show here, or Le Corbusier's, as in the l'unité d'habitation, this design for apartments that could house a large number of people, taking advantage of efficiency, but also presenting a new aesthetic. So this, after World War II created a kind of break in production in Europe, and at the same time, when the economies began to recover, when architects went back to work, there was no longer such a pressing need to prove modern aesthetics in most places, in many places. So you had this kind of output of modern buildings. This style that had been a kind of avant-garde project before the war was suddenly, or finally, the norm. It was even aspirational and became the kind of basic template for shopping malls, commercial spaces, institutions, and homes as well. So what had happened, though, to the ethos of sort of solidarity with the less fortunate, to trying to distribute the goods of, say, industrial life to everybody? Architects and critics of architecture began to ask this question about this kind of production, or about architecture, which tended to result in these kinds of large projects, and not so much to push forward that research that had been begun before the war. And this critique, essentially, in some of its strongest forms that emerged around 1968 with the sort of widespread left-wing movements, essentially concluded that the architect can't actually lead the sort of capitalist society in providing for everybody, but had to follow instead what was already sort of marked out, could work only within the spaces allotted to it by the market, basically. And after this, as this was becoming sort of received view, architects stopped aspiring, or some high-profile architects who might alternatively have aspired to solve problems turned more toward a formal research, developing formal investigations that were more prized for the nature of the process or the systematic way of working, or departing from the austere or orthogonal geometries of the modern, or being ironic in some sense, putting out a kind of model like a prototype, but not really believing that it's ever going to be sort of repeated everywhere and sort of change the world. But I'm interested still in this kind of, not so much revolutionary modernism, but that modernism that tried to, say, like improve the conditions of everyone, that linked this aesthetic to a kind of practical resistance against, let's say, the forces that were driving and constraining the ability to provide for all. So I'm very interested in the critique of modern architecture, but I'm also interested in studying examples of architects who somehow seem to suggest an alternative reality to that which the critique was looking at. So for example, the critical architects were looking at a certain kind of architecture practice, often at architects who were building private houses, who had come from upper classes in the first place. And there were many architects who were not published in journals and not talked about in architecture schools or trade meetings and so forth. And so I'm interested in some of those architects. And in particular, in this current project on Charles Fleming, I'm interested in studying an architect who was himself working for an African-American community, which by and large was not part of the conversation about architecture in these main channels. So what did that mean? What might his practice have meant or uncovered that would be relevant to the critique of architecture? And in particular, if he was working as he was in St. Louis, which was a place at the time still governed by the logics of Jim Crow, which entailed a kind of segregation of black and white, and unequal facilities and resources and potential to advance, could an architect work against racism and then by that means resist the forces of the capitalistic system of that place? Because in fact, Jim Crow laws served not only a kind of straightforwardly to racial segregation, but also to preserve a kind of unskilled labor class by naturalizing the separateness and unequalness. So that's the premise that I'm working through. The architect Charles Fleming, born 1937 and raised in Richmond Heights, which is a suburb at the edge of St. Louis, a community of African Americans, mostly 95%, according to his estimate, migrants from Mississippi and Louisiana since the Reconstruction. So there was a sort of pipeline, Memphis, East St. Louis, and then points north, Indiana, Gary, Indiana, Detroit, Chicago, and so forth. His neighborhood included many tradespeople who maybe, as in the case of his grandfather, hung wallpaper for wealthy people, or worked in other trades, bricklayers and so forth, but who also worked for each other in a kind of informal economy. And he then learned his first education was in this community, learning how to do construction and so forth. Eventually, by 1960, he earned a building certificate from Washington University in the night school, going back to Reto's observations about who can become an architect. He seems to have essentially gotten into that program because while working in the office of an architect, based on his skills he had, he heard about this program and decided it might be good for him. Afterwards, he opened his own office. His first projects were for essentially the emerging black middle class. For example, the Gateway Bank was the first black-owned bank in St. Louis, which was significant at the time because all the banks were owned by the white community and would not hire black tellers. So to go to the bank always meant to enter into this a system in which there was no trust between the person who was serving you and so forth. So this bank then, which Fleming gives this really modest but distinctively stylish exterior, which was a renovation project, but with these fins that came off of it and the sign. So you can see the fins, which were really echoing some of the projects that were going up around St. Louis at the time. An image from some of the promotional materials of the bank, sort of to marketing to the black community. The funeral home, so not a project that first comes to our mind when we think of the new modern life and reality, but a project that gave sort of dignity and normalcy, in a sense, to a community that did not have such facilities to begin with. A medical clinic. Most of these early projects have been demolished, don't exist anymore, as was this one, which is in Kinloch, which was destroyed to create the airport. He did also a couple of churches, Mount Esther Baptist, a very simple, straightforward project, a box, but with the kind of gestures that are somehow helping to frame that place, to make the place, like the wall that goes around the site and the sheltered entrance. So his career from these early projects blossomed. He formed a partnership with another architect, and after that partnership dissolved, he formed his own office quite independently, Fleming Corporation, with many employees. So I'm just going to talk about very briefly about this one project, the Arthur J. Kennedy Skill Training Center, which it was a sort of trade school, and what interests me in this ongoing research is that it wasn't a kind of it didn't happen all by itself. It was the architect getting involved with programs that the federal government had had set up. So the Department of the Cabinet of Department of Housing and Urban Development was established in the mid-60s with a local office in Fort Worth, Texas, actually. So the regional office. So all the projects in St. Louis had to come out of applications that went to Fort Worth to get the money. So he was an architect who came of age as these kind of Johnson administration era programs were being put out to put money into the inner city. And so he fell into this project, which was essentially a school and also a placement agency. It was built in a zone of St. Louis that was targeted for development with a kind of systems approach. So they combined a new healthcare center and the training center. They had union members or union certified tradespeople come to the school to teach the students. They selected the students very carefully from local high schools. And so it was a way of very carefully shepherding a small number of people through learning how to be a welder, for example, or how to fix things to become a janitor or building manager, jobs that otherwise they would not have been able to have. So it's very much within the kind of modern sort of material language, these masonry walls and standing seam metal roof. There's also a story behind that because Fleming was only able to work with certain contractors because the white contractors wouldn't work for him as subcontractors. So he worked with black contractors who he often had to sort of teach how to do the details that he wanted. So it was a very collaborative process for him. But my point here, I suppose, is that it's a modern building. He's doing, in a sense, a modern form of modern architecture in a very earnest way, and it is set up in such a way that it is reconfiguring, in a sense, the sort of distribution of labor and capacity around him. It was closed in 1984 when the federal funds ran out. By that time, it was a very much loved local institution. Thousands of students had gone through it and gone on to get jobs. And in fact, when it was torn down some years after, in the 1990s, the local alderman and an activist staged a symbolic protest that got them into the paper. Which I show that just because it goes to show how this work that came out of the imagination of the architect, in the context in which he made it, became cherished by the public, in a sense. So I'm reflecting on how it may constitute a kind of a successful model of the modern practice in his time and in his place. Thank you.
Thank you, Reto, Andrew, and Shantel. And Shantel in particular, I think the discussion of Charles Fleming, I feel, is a perfect sort of segue to just a little snapshot of my own research and work, which in this case I'll present briefly on the work of architect Bertrand Goldberg and his iconic Marina City project in Chicago, which actually has many parallels to what Shantel was just presenting. It's a collaborative project that I worked on with a dear friend and colleague, Caterina Ruedi-Ray, that resulted in a monograph that was published on the project. The project is significant because it was launched at a moment in time and there was a maybe very different context, but also maybe not too dissimilar to what we are experiencing today. A height of the Cold War, great international tensions, and this is a cover page from the Chicago Sun-Times at that time announcing both the famous Khrushchev tour of the US, where there was a fierce competition for sort of consumer goods between the East and the West, and also the global space race, but also this particular project, Marina City, which at that time was funded with 25 million, a very staggering amount to really fund what was fundamentally the first sort of mixed-use housing project in downtown Chicago at a time when we had a very different kind of a trend where people were actually fleeing to the suburbs and city was actually de-densifying and decentralizing. The architect, Bertrand Goldberg, is on the left, but actually he was a part of a bigger team that also included William McFetridge, the kind of skeptically looking, person in the middle, who is the president of who was the president of the Chicago's janitors unions. And oftentimes, people ask me, who was the enlightened client behind such a progressive circular towers? And actually, it's the Chicago janitors that decided to invest their pension funds in this project as a way to both make a good financial investment, but also to really contribute to the renaissance of the city of Chicago. Chuck Swibel on the right, he's more optimistic. He's actually a realtor, so obviously he's trying to make a deal and creating a particular atmosphere here. In the book, Katerina and I discuss how, as an architect, Goldberg had to bring a series of skills to a project like this, to really work innovative with form and structure, to really work innovative with finance as well, kind of like Fleming, to really understand trade unions and kind of the flows of the capitalism at that time, and to work not only with Swibel and McFetridge in the middle, but also Mayor Richard Daley on the left. And we love this image with Swibel kind of patting Mayor Daley on his cheek as they sort of try to sort of envision this new project during the groundbreaking ceremony. But McFetridge, as a president of the janitors union, really summed it up nicely why they built the project. Quote, "If we can't make jobs any other way, we will build buildings to put our men into," end quote. And basically what he's saying at a time when everybody was fleeing for the suburb in terms of housing, in terms of office space, they decided to actually build this project as a way to put janitors to work. Goldberg, as an architect, understood that context, and also he understood the importance of drawings and images to really pitch this project to the public as a real project of change. He even went to FHA to DC to present this project to get and garner some additional federal funding. Interestingly enough, he didn't present two circular towers. He presented very conventional rectangular tower because he didn't want to risk any confrontation with the federal government. But interestingly enough, in order to gain the funding, Goldberg, McFetridge, and Swibel had to actually work to reclassify single people and families without children as families eligible for FHA mortgages, because otherwise they wouldn't be eligible, because the funding model was for a traditional family in the suburbs. And this kind of a building had a high density structure with a lot of efficiencies, a lot of studios, and one-bedroom apartments. They also had to work to change the zoning laws. Oftentimes in Houston, we lament on the kind of lack of zoning and what kind of urbanism it results in. Sometimes zoning creates its own problems too. In particular in the 60s, the zoning laws in downtown wouldn't allow for any kind of mixed use development. So basically they had to reclassify a single block into a district to do that. The project was built between 1959 and 1964, and really, when you look at it here, it's on that edge, north edge of downtown Chicago before you get to the kind of a River North and near North Side, which is mostly the warehouse district. And it was first, and for the long time, the only housing project in the city of that kind. Not a public housing, but a mixed housing project that really sparked the kind of renaissance of the downtown of Chicago. I won't go into many details of the projects. In part, I just want to highlight that Goldberg, as an architect, advocated for living above the store, and for the project to have a longevity, he argued it had to be mixed use. It had to provide amenities for the residents for them to really stay there for a long time. At the same time, in this kind of space age and competition at that time, he also argued that the project really needed to be what we would call today probably sustainable and resilient, to use electrical energy other than some of the other types of energy to make both more energy efficient and affordable system of apartments. And these are the actual sort of wedges of the towers showing 2-bedroom, 1-bedroom, and efficiency unit that are really fairly modest and straightforward on the inside, but they all result in a really beautiful, spacious balcony, which is meant to compensate what you don't have on the inside, you gain on the outside. There's a whole number of savings achieved by the circular plan in terms of structure, the central core, also eliminating some of the exterior walls, which result in more efficient kind of energy conservation on the inside of the building, as opposed to energy loss, which is a big issue in Chicago. But what Goldberg really brought to the table was not only the understanding of this whole kind of energy, construction, economy, investment, but also really he brought design skills and really the sort of beauty and quality of drawing and bookmaking to convince the public in the merits of this kind of project. The two squares on the top are the two brochures that the office designed to convince the public in the kind of beauty of the circular housing plan. So they all came with these sort of fold-outs where you can see the 2-bedroom, 1-bedroom unit apartments, and it came with a little furniture template convincing people you can be your own architect and place your own piano, if you wish, in a circular plan of Marina City, because that was always obviously one of the concerns. In addition to that, before the project was even built, in the headquarters of the Janitors Union in Chicago, Goldberg built this very interesting full-scale mock-up of one of the apartments, trying to convince not only the janitors but also the public in the beauty of urban living. Because the hardest issue here was not only the financial issue, but convincing people that they should stay in the city and that urban living is not only dignified, but also really beautiful. And as a way to do that, they built this sort of full-scale mock-up so people can enjoy and kind of look at the view that one would have from the imaginary, I believe, the 40th floor of Marina City. And then they also invested, once the first few floors were built, into building, obviously, show apartments which can actually show the kind of beautiful balcony and kind of the visual effects that it has. I love these images from the kind of headquarters of the janitors unions with McFetridge, the president, and the planning commissioner taking pictures in front of this sort of imaginary view from one of the balconies of the Marina City. One of the banks was owned by the owners of the Ebony magazine at the time, who really heavily invested not only in Marina City, but also in promoting the experience of Black residents after the project was built and trying to really create an inclusive picture of the housing in this particular case, which in the early 1960s in Chicago was still a big problem because many of the African American applicants from Tennessee were denied just on the basis of race as they tried to move between different housing complexes. And then the November 1964 issue of the Ebony magazine had a wonderful feature of 6 African American residents in the complex telling the stories of why they like to live in Marina City and what kind of self-expression the complex allows for, including Miss Johnson, who is a librarian and a teacher and loves to dance, and the balcony allows for that, and then the kind of relaxing views that one can experience on the roof deck. Albert Gaskin was denied for tenancy, in particular in the north side, which is where he wanted to live, and in Evanston, and then eventually settled in the apartment in Marina City. And the issue of the Ebony magazine documents his own experience, in particular, not only in the apartment, but also in the mixed-use elements of the complex, in particular the restaurant, and so on. But this idea that there is something really beautiful or inherently beautiful about urban living, about density, is something that Goldberg as architect and Goldberg and Associates tried to pitch more broadly. The idea of getting together not only in the mixed-use spaces of the restaurant or the marina itself and so on, but also on one's own balconies. The balconies allow the space for gatherings and interaction. In many ways, this idea of kind of gathering, urbanity, balconies, the views is what really gave the longevity to the project, and to this day, it's a popular place to live. It is also what gave it a particular presence in popular culture. I know, Carlos, you love movies, and this is one of those buildings that kind of kept recurring in many films, including Mickey 1 by Arthur Penn with Warren Beatty, where there's a whole number of scenes being filmed in Marina City and the kind of nighttime or daytime effects that the building provides. And of course, once it makes to the cover page of National Geographic, it has become a popular icon, or the Jetsons for that matter. But really, as an architect, Goldberg really worked very hard to implement and kind of imprint images, and in particular beautiful views from the balconies into popular consciousness. He hired some of the most famous photographers of the time, including Hedrick Blessing firm, that documented every step of the way as the building was actually being built. And again, those kinds of things linger until today, or sorts of today, because I think this is now about maybe almost 20 years long. The Marina City kind of keeps reoccurring as a kind of a icon of urbanity, not only in the city of Chicago, but also more broadly. But I would say, it's those skills of the architect to kind of draw, to visualize, to make form, but to understand how that form sits in the larger context that kind of gave the project that kind of longevity. In closing, I would say many of those things come from education. They don't come in a vacuum. Goldberg was actually a student at the Bauhaus between 1932 and 1933, and for those of you historians in the rooms, that was the final year of the Bauhaus. He took, so to speak, the last train from Berlin as Hitler was seizing power, escaping to Paris and then back to the U.S. This is an example of one of his student works, the study of circles, done under the supervision of amazing Josef Albers, who was really rigorous in teaching his students how to take a simple single geometry or color and then to vary it and multiply many times. And in kind of these kinds of exercises, Goldberg learned to appreciate these kind of simple shapes that eventually we see resurfacing at Marina City. In addition to that, he was an avid reader. 1932-33 was a tumultuous year in Germany as Hitler was seizing powers. And one of the key guest speakers at the Bauhaus was a person called Vladimir Wojtyński, who was actually the president of the Association of German Labor Unions. So he came to speak often about his experience with both labor unions and trade unions in Germany and his earlier experience during the Russian Revolution. Eventually, Wojtyński, like Goldberg, escapes Berlin through Paris, comes and settles in the U.S., and he sort of wrote a very sort of influential book here in the U.S., The Social Consequences of the Economic Depression and the Impact of the sort of economy here, both in the East and also here in the West as well. And it was from these kind of readings that Goldberg kind of developed this interesting phrase, capitalism for a common man, and what architect can do in that particular context to intervene in that kind of society. So Albers was a good segue for me to mention that all of the schools, in a sense, schools of architecture are connected in these kinds of conversations. And we have our own link to Josef Albers, a long-standing faculty member here in the school. Eleanor Evans was a student of Albers's at Yale, and she also worked with very simple abstract materials, but also real materials like leaves and sticks and so on, so to create these very interesting geometrical patterns. And it is this kind of a link between kind of making things by hand, intuitively, formally, but also at the same time thinking about a larger picture, be it social or cultural, that kind of links and binds the work of the architects on a daily basis. These are just some snapshots from our studios in the last couple of days. Dawn, these are your students in the introductory graduate studios. I like these images because they show the work in progress. I hope you don't mind me showing the work that's not fully cooked yet, but it does look beautiful, and of course it shows images of people and scale figures as we try to understand how the spaces that we designed, even on a small scale, impact the sort of scale and experience of people. A couple of images also from the totalization review yesterday from Adam Frampton's section, a mixed-use complex that kind of integrates a couple of different programs in New York, and both kind of examples of that kind of formal work, but also the conversation and debate that takes place around the work, which is, as it was said several times this evening, an integral part of how we think about architecture. Again, making things, but also having a discussion and collective conversation about the importance of those things. So for those of you, online or here who are new to architecture, again, stay connected with the school. This is an image of our website and a beautiful building by Carlos Jimenez that's opening next weekend, the Buddhist Center here in Houston. That really is a good example of that sort of influence and impact that architecture has, both here locally, but also more broadly in the world and more globally. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for these absolutely fascinating talks. We've got time for maybe 3 or 4 questions. The dean will call on you. I will run with the microphone. Does anybody want to start us off? Oh, great.
Thank you for your presentations. I actually had a question for Reto. I'm very interested in education, especially at the secondary level, and so I was wondering what the response was from teachers, how they saw architecture being part of their curriculum, how compatible they thought it was with their curriculum and their goals, and with students' attitudes. Thank you.
I can't really tell you yet. We're hosting the teacher workshops only this coming spring, so we haven't had a ton of feedback from teachers yet. There's been some that I think really appreciated the program at large and are interested in finding ways in which they can integrate it. But I think how we can tap in and what that traction is going to be, I think, is to be seen as we move forward. COVID basically threw in a wrench engaging teachers at large. They were preoccupied with far more significant kind of challenges than enriching their kind of programs at that moment. And so it seems like now the kind of right moment to kind of try to start to do that.
There's kind of a common thread in, I guess, 3 of the presentations. If there's a question of agency, and the title of this is People's Architect, then at least in the opening statement of who's doing the designing, and then it kind of turns into not only who's doing the designing, but for whom they're designing, and then in the end, whom is occupying the building. With Bill Claudel being cited right at the beginning, I am wondering that there's always this question of not only designing what the person or the end user needs, but trying to get an interaction from the architect and the designer on perceiving what the client actually wants or the people want. So this is kind of a malformed question, but could you speak to how agency is not only necessarily acknowledging the problem, but also seeking and listening to find the problem, and also how shall we approach agency moving forward, understanding that it hasn't been addressed well in the past?
Who wants to take that?
Do you want any of us to tackle that in particular, or?
It's a great question. It's very big.
I'm happy to start, and hopefully some of my colleagues will chime in. I think it's a very important question, like what is the agency, and is it a one-way street, or is it a two-way street, and how do you establish those lines of communication. I would say for me, if I reflect on, in particular, for example, in some of my own research, on Goldberg and some of the other architects, I would say the agency also for architects in particular comes down to the ability to provide imagination, both that comes from your own head, but also the one that can be sparked in other people. That, one of our biggest failures, I feel, when we talk about, for example, social change or environmental collapse, is our inability to have imagination that's not only formal, but also political. And I think a big part in that conversation is that many parts of our society have been denied right to imagination. You're kind of living out the future that your history gave you. And changing that is a kind of a multi-layered process that I think needs to take place in many different ways, like all the way from kind of the pipeline to college, to education, and then also once we are out in the field, working with different communities. So for me, it's the power to really provide your own unleashed imagination, but also to engage the imagination of others as a way to lead to change.
I don't know if my talk was one that inspired your question, but I think I just wanted to speak to the importance of getting in the game, so to speak, being in a capacity to step in. So Charles Fleming, got his license, and that meant that he could be considered for projects that might have been done by somebody else. They might have been done by somebody who didn't turn around and get his neighbors trained to be contractors. And so because he was the one, a lot of followed from that. So similarly, I think when you're an architect, sometimes getting a license means that you can be the one to do something. You find yourself unexpectedly in a position of power.
I don't know if I'm not sure if we're all required to respond to this, but I think I think about the question of agency a lot, maybe, and I always think about it in very kind of scalar terms. There are thousands of people for every architect in the United States. So for instance, I've never done a project for a client who inhabits the building. Every project I've ever done or been involved in, the client is always somebody who's shepherding a building through a process, and the building is really for other people. In my experience, more often than not, those people are to come. I can't define them. I can't go and talk to them. And I say that because I think that as certainly in practice, in my own experience in practice, and certainly it's something I talk about with students, right? That it's important for us to have a kind of perspective and have our own agency in that process, and to try it, but acknowledge our own limitations in that as well. And I suppose I'm saying that because I don't know. I wish I'd had the opportunity at some point to talk to an end user of the building in a certain way, but I've actually never experienced that, and that has to do with just the kind of scalar discrepancy in the forms of development and the kind of ways in which we actually operate in the world more often than not, and that's somewhat a unique experience, but I think it's actually pretty relevant to the way a lot of people practice. So I think it's important to certainly seek out that opportunity if you have the kind of chance in the process of practicing, but to acknowledge also that that's a rare experience, I think, actually, and more often than not, you're going to be asked to be a kind of client, to be the kind of perspective, and therefore it kind of relies on you to help imagine, who's going to use the building, how they're going to do it, how they're going to engage with it, and you have to be humble in that, I think, more often than not.
Full round, I guess I have to. I guess one of the questions we have to ask first is whose agency? The client's agency, the user's agency, which might not be the client's agency, the architect's agency, the student's agency. And I think at the end of the day, we have to kind of consider all these kind of different viewpoints and perspectives, and that's where probably a conversation has to begin, because I think we use the word agency as if there were kind of one agency, but I think there are many different kind of parties involved at the end of the day, right? And I think understanding what those kind of different perspectives are is probably the first step toward a constructive dialogue.
Wonderful. Well, Igor, Shantel, Andrew, and Reto, thank you so much for your brilliant talks. And thank you to the School of Architecture. It's been a thrill to be here, and we get to continue the conversations across the hall. Please join us for the reception. Thank you again all so much for coming.